All right, we're going to go ahead and get started on our energy flow notes. This is the second note set in Ecology, so let's just get right into it. The notes are going to be set up like this, so if you use note-taking like this standard piece of paper idea, that's perfectly fine. However, I would recommend that you switch to using a notebook, kind of a page for each section. This just lets you get anything that you need. Other than that, we'll go ahead and hop in. So now that we've organized everything in Ecology into specific groups so that we can look at them more specifically, we can take a look at energy flow. How does energy move through an ecosystem? So that's our goal. We need to map out how this energy is moving through the ecosystem. Of course, the source of all energy in this case is going to be the sun. While an abiotic factor and not part of any food chain or food web, it is the source of all energy in the biosphere. And so we always start all of our energy conversations about energy flow with the sun. Now, the sun is going to provide energy to some very specific important things. And we call this entire group of important things like algae or seaweed or all kinds of plants on land. We call these things producers because these are any organism that absorbs sunlight through photosynthesis. So photosynthesis obviously is a term you all have heard before. We've talked about it before this year. Of course, it's converting sunlight and CO2 and water into oxygen, glucose, otherwise known as sugar, and that ever important energy thing, ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So we'll get into that a little bit more, but what you guys need to know is that the first type of organism that we are discussing here, the most important organism, you might say, in the ecosystem energy flow lesson is the producer. And that's any organism that absorbs sunlight through photosynthesis. And that's going to be plants. So you've got algae, which produce 70 to 80% of the world's oxygen. And then all of the other kinds of plants, whether on land or on sea, they absorb the sunlight and they release oxygen. Those are your producers. Consumers, on the other side, are any organism that eats other organisms to survive. They consume other organisms. Now, they can consume other organisms like other animals, whether insects or meat or things like that, or they can consume plants, in which case we're talking about herbivores. Herbivores are any organism that eats only plants to survive. Now, I've heard people say this before, like, well, my rabbit one time, he ate, not only did he eat like some carrots, but he also ate some ham. Does that mean he's not an herbivore anymore? No. Rabbits, even if they eat a little bit of something else, their primary source of nutrients are plants, making them herbivores. Any organism that primarily rests upon plants is an herbivore. Now, just because they may eat a little bit of meat, very, 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 very rarely does not make them a carnivore or an omnivore. Take the Venus flytrap, for example. Yes, it eats flies, but it gets most of its energy primarily from the sunlight. That's why it's green. It goes through photosynthesis. It creates glucose by turning water, sunlight, and CO2 into oxygen, ATP, and glucose. Now, most important here is that you understand the Latin that we're breaking down here. Herbe, meaning plant, herbs and spices, and then vor, meaning eater. And that's going to come up a couple of different times here. Heterotroph. Heterotroph means different eater. So you'll remember back a few slides ago when we were talking about producers, I have the word autotroph there. Autotroph is not a really cool name for a transformer. Autotroph means self-feeding. So a trough is what animals eat out of. I mean, obviously it's spelled a little differently, but that's how I remember it. Trough means to eat or feeding. So autotroph means self-feeding. The plants absorb the sunlight and feed themselves, whereas an heterotroph eats different organisms. It's like a consumer. The most common type of heterotroph, obviously herbivores are heterotrophs, but when I think of something eating different things, I think of a carnivore. I think of any organism that eats meat or eggs or insects to survive. So your carnivores are going to be things like lions, things like those kinds of felines, wolves and such, things that only eat meat. And you see that in the name. Carne meaning meat and vor meaning eater. This is why chili con carne literally translates to chili pasta with meat. And that's the idea here, is that we're seeing these organisms that only eat meat. Now, you'll notice that the word insects appears up there. Of course, yes, insects are animals, and animals that eat usually only insects are not only carnivores, we call them insectivores because they are insect eaters. So again, carnivores, pretty self-explanatory, they eat meat. Omnivores are any organism that must eat plants and animals to survive. You fit in this category. You can choose, of course, personally to be vegan, but that is not something that is healthier for you. In fact, people who are vegan have to take special supplements in order to survive. You cannot eat only plants and have a healthy, active lifestyle without supplements. And you cannot eat only meat and have a healthy, active lifestyle without supplements. You need both meat and plants in order to survive, like bears. So there's, of course, Mr. Barrington again making his debut again in the energy flow notes. So you see he's got some fish from the nearby river as well as berries. Bears are notorious for enjoying berries and other summer fruits. And, of course, the Greek here, or the Latin, I should say, omni meaning all and vor meaning eater. So omni meaning all and vor meaning eater. So they eat everything. They eat all kinds of stuff. So those are your three main types of organisms. We're going to get into the last two, which are pretty simple, and then we'll really be wrapping it up with food chain, food web, and energy pyramid. So the other kind of organisms that we're going to see interact in energy flow are scavengers. Scavengers are organisms that eat already dead organisms, like a turkey buzzard. They see that roadkill lying on the road. The bear got a little bit too close to the freeway and then gets smacked by a Ford F-150. And the scavenger comes to clean it up. Scavengers are a very essential part of the food web because if scavengers did not exist, there would be nasty, gross, dead things lying all over the ground all the time. Scavengers are extremely important. They eat all of the gross, gunk, dead animals and, as well, some plants in order to get all of the fresh goodness that had just passed away. Now, after that occurs, after the buzzard has had his fill of the dead roadkill, what comes along? Decomposers. Decomposers are organisms that break down dead things to recycle their nutrients. And they break things down all the way down to the chemical level. They actually rip apart what the organism is made out of so that they can recycle those nutrients back into the ecosystem. This includes things like worms, fungi, mushrooms, and bacteria. This is the lovely process of rotting, and thank goodness that things rot. Otherwise, again, things would just stay dead and lying around everywhere. Whereas when your pet rabbit died, your parents buried it in the garden so that it could, be used as fertilizer after it was broken down by decomposers for next year's crops. And again, that constant circle of life is what's really important here, is that the sun gives energy to the autotrophs, the producers, the plants. Then those feed the herbivores and omnivores, and then the carnivores eat the omnivores and herbivores, which after the carnivores die leaves us with, the scavengers and then the decomposers to clean up the mess. And this entire idea culminates in the food chain. The food chain, which is the map of energy flow that shows one path from producer to decomposer. Now you've heard, top of the food chain before. The food chain's not an alien concept to you, but it's important to know that the food chain is a great map of how energy flows through the ecosystem. And the food chain does not just mean what animal can eat another animal. A food chain is only good if it actually shows an animal eating what it's supposed to. Allow me to explain. I received a food chain as an assignment turned in from a student of mine a couple years ago, and it went like this. So I'll give you a sample food chain here. The sun gives energy to grass, the rabbit eats the grass, the wolf eats the rabbit, the buzzard, then when the wolf dies, eats the wolf, and the worms eventually will decompose the buzzard. However, the student had, I think, like grass, and then a rabbit eats the grass, and then a deer eats the rabbit, and then tarantulas eats the rabbit, and then a snake eats the tarantula, and then a human eats the snake, and then an eagle eats the human, and then a bear eats the eagle. And I was just really confused at this crazy food chain. No. Remember, a food chain is just a map of that ecosystem. So you need to show a similar type of animal or organism in the biome interacting in a correct way with the organisms around it. You put all of these together in a food web. You Put a couple food chains together and you get a food web. It's a map of different paths showing how energy flows in a community. Remember, a community is just a group of living organisms. Now, what I'm going to show here is, it'll look at first like a pretty complex series of words and arrows. Relax. If you look up there, it's really only 10 words. Grass, acorns, berries, those are your plants. Then squirrels, rabbits, and a bear. Owl and wolf, worms and bacteria. After that, they're just the arrows where different organisms are eating different things in order to survive. Now, this is a very simple food web. Often food webs have 30 to 40 different parts in them, and that's on the lower end. But for these notes, I'm not going to make you draw 30 to 40 different words in a food web, just so that you have an idea that food chains interact into a food web. That's the main idea I want you to get out of this. Lastly, but not leastly, is the energy pyramid. An energy pyramid is a map of how much energy is lost as it is passed through the community. Have you ever wondered why a lion has to eat so much? Like why a lion has to eat an entire gazelle every couple of days to survive, but Fluffernutter the rabbit can, eat a couple of handfuls of grass and be good for a little bit? There's a reason why, and I'm going to show you. So, of course, we're going to start with the sun, and what we're going to do with an energy pyramid is we're going to track the amount of energy that passes through the food chain, through the food web, as it goes up each trophic level. Now, trophic actually is a word that, again, means feeding. So it's spelled like trough, T-R-O-P-H, but it has an I-C at the end, so it's trophic, it's food-related. So as you go up one food level, how does the energy pass along with it? So we see here first, the sun gives lots of energy to the producers. That's why they're on the bottom. They have the largest amount of energy down there. And then herbivores eat the producers. So they're getting most of that energy. The herbivores, they're running around, hopping around, scurrying around, and they're wasting some of that energy as they run around. And then omnivores usually get a hold of them, or carnivores, but omnivores, they're going to get some of the plants, and they're going to get some of the herbivores, and they're going to have a nice meal out of it. Again, not as much energy because, they have to do some work for it. They had to catch the scurrying thing around, and you don't get as much energy from herbivores as you do from plants. Then carnivores are only going to be eating omnivores and herbivores. So, because they only eat meat, they're going to get less energy than the omnivores or the herbivores would. Then you have secondary carnivores. Secondary carnivores are carnivores that eat even more agile and ridiculously strong and fast meat. So they have to chase stuff down and attack stuff. And then at the very tippy top, you have the apex predators, the top of the food chain, the eagles, the owls, the lions, the tigers, and those kinds of organisms that have to do a lot of work to get their food. So why does this pyramid look like this? Why is there energy lost? Well, there's energy lost at each level because it's hot out there, guys. When you're doing exercise like, none of you are doing right now, you burn calories. Calories are just a fancy name for stored energy. So when you burn up that stored energy, whoever's going to eat you is going to have a lot less energy. When you go to the grocery store and you're looking at different types of beef, you're going to get a nice, awesome steak. You want a cow that was just lazy as all get out. Because if you have a really athletic cow, he will have burnt off all of that delicious fatty goodness that attaches to the meat and makes it flavorful and full of energy. You want a lazy cow, one that has stored up energy that's all fatty and delicious. That's really the idea of the energy pyramid. The further you go up this table, the further you go up this map, there's less energy for the things eating. So producers have pretty much as much energy as they want. I mean, as long as the sun's on that day, they're going to get energy for photosynthesis. Herbivores have a lot of energy because there's a lot of plants, and the plants are chock full of energy. And as you move up, there is slightly less and less energy to eat from. So that's basically the idea. So if we were to put this into numbers, for all those math kids out there, we call this the 10% rule, because usually 10% is always lost to heat with each trophic level. Now, that's really the end of the notes, and we might get through that and say, well, Mr. Kinnett, that's pretty simple stuff. I understood that. Some things eat plants, some things eat meat, some things eat both, some things eat dead things, and some things break it all down. You put them together in a food chain, you put those food chains together in a food web, and here's a shocker: the further away you get from the sun, there's less energy. I know all of this. Well, good. The best part about ecology is that you have spent almost all of your life observing the environment around you, so a lot of this stuff comes across as common sense. And again, that's my goal through this ecology unit. I want to give you a functional, realistic, and simple understanding of what's going on in the environment and how it's all interacting. That's all I have for you guys. Stay tuned, and we'll keep on going.